that was a long piece because we've almost forgotten all that has transpired over the last few years. It's a mammoth task that Judge Raymond Zondo and his team have to deal with starting tomorrow.
Yeah, we'll have to eat this elephant, and it will have to be piece by piece. And I'm quite sure that we've now got the right person presiding over the matter. It's going to be a tedious and a lengthy process. It's going to reveal much. Much of it, of course, is already in the public domain. But I believe we're going to have seats right next to the ring. And we'll be able to see blow by blow what transpires.
In the most public way as
Absolutely.
well. And that, I suppose, is the very definition of transparency that's really been needed here. What can you tell us about what the format of this inquiry will be? What will be the scope from a legal point of view?
Firstly, we have to say it's not a trial. So there's no accused before the judge. There's no person going to be convicted. It's merely an inquiry into the establishment, of a state capture of any of the state-owned enterprises. So it's going to inquire Eskom, it's going to inquire in respect of Transnet, and it's going to entail, of course, the various positions that were promised to certain political figures in return for being loyal to either the Guptas or to President Zuma. So it will be an inquiry to establish if those people were in fact captured, if those departments were in fact captured. And if they were captured, then of course we can expect remedial action. Number one, the MPA might be advised to consider prosecuting certain individuals. It might result in certain people having to leave their positions, whichever they occupy. So we can definitely expect people to tumble and positions to tumble following the inquiry. But ultimately, people will testify. They can, of course, testify in camera if they made an application, and if the judge believes that it's in the interest of justice to do so, then, of course, he can decide if the evidence of such a sensitive nature that it should be held in camera. But I think that would go against the thing that you posed, the transparency. One would expect everything to be dealt with in the open, so that it doesn't seem like anything is being swept under the carpet.
For the layperson to understand, we know that Judge Raymond Zondo is overseeing this commission as well. Will organizations or people that accusations have been made against, will they be allowed to cross-question, or will they be allowed to have legal representatives to cross-question those who are giving testimony?
Well, what we know is that regulations were promulgated, and these regulations have set out the terms and conditions under which the inquiry will act. And what will happen is that any person, they will firstly have a group of people, a legal group of people that would investigate all the claims and obtain statements from all the people. And the moment they ascertain that a person is being implicated by a witness, they then have to notify that aggrieved person of the fact that, listen, you've been implicated by the former Minister Jonas, for argument's sake. You now have the opportunity of making your own submissions. If you want to cross-examine him whilst he testifies, you are welcome to do so. So they can have a legal representative there, they can question the witness, and at the end of the day, they can give evidence themselves. So every person that's being affected, if we can call them an affected party, can of course attend the proceedings, of course have his say, but I think one would actually expect many of them perhaps not to take part in the process because they might feel that, listen, this will most probably be a witch hunt, and that's why I don't want to be involved. And of course, many of them have been implicated in the public domain already, and there is no defense to it because the evidence is compelling. So ultimately, every one of them will have the opportunity of participating by cross-examining witnesses. The only exception is, of course, if you're not a person that's been implicated, you will not have the opportunity to cross-examine. And we saw that with the DA asking the judge for the right to cross-examine all witnesses and be a party. And you can make submissions. But I would expect, if I, for argument's sake, make a submission and it's just a bold submission, let's say it's a political statement involving state capture, giving evidence, but it doesn't necessarily point a finger to any individual, then I don't think I'll be cross-examined. But my evidence will still be led by the legal team appointed by Judge Zondo to assist him in arriving at the right finding at the end of the day.
Now, obviously, the Gupta name is front and center to this State Capture Commission, and indeed the Public Protector's State of Capture report released by the then Public Protector Thuli Madonsela. The big question is whether they will be called to give testimony, whether they would want to. My question is, if they decide not to make an appearance, would they be allowed to have legal representation in the commission if they're not there physically themselves?
Well, it's a good question. The rules doesn't say anything about that. What it does say is that if you are an affected party, you can attend and you can oppose, and of course you can have a legal representation there to represent you. Now, the only time when you can have an attorney in court when you don't have to be there is, for argument's sake, in a civil matter. So this, and remember, the rules developed for this specific inquiry is really relaxed. Hearsay evidence might be admissible, where in a normal court it wouldn't be admissible. So Judge Zondo can dictate what is allowed and what isn't allowed. So he could say, listen, I'm happy with your attorney making submissions, and I'm happy with your attorney cross-examining a witness, with you perhaps not being there. It doesn't say that the person has to per se be there, but of course, we'll only know once the judge has made this known in the public domain.
Now, big news today. The Sunday Times is reporting that Judge Zondo had written to former President Jacob Zuma, asking him to say whether he used information he came across as head of state to enrich himself and the Guptas. So he's now, from a legal point of view, I suppose, written to him, asking him that question. And then also, he's been asked, apparently, according to this report, if he wants to give evidence in person. Now, this, of course, is going to be the question everybody's going to ask and wait for, to see if there's going to be a big reveal of the former president appearing. How important would that be, A? And B, if he doesn't make an appearance, what kind of impact could that be on the commission?
Well, let's say, I think the perception that we all have of our current president is that he's a fighter for justice. And one would expect him to seize an opportunity to show to the public that he is, number one, not captured, and that he's a person that wants to contribute towards a process which was created by President. Because remember, of course, Thuli Madonsela said we should have a public inquiry, and then the President was to order it. And once the judge had been appointed to then say, well, the commission will run from this and this day. So the President played an important part in this. And we should not forget that President Ramaphosa was the Deputy President in Cabinet. So he's been in Cabinet for many years. So I'm quite sure somewhere along the line he must have heard something, he must have seen something. It's not a question of see no evil, hear no evil when you sit next to the former president, surrounded by ministers who are obviously captured. So somehow I think he can contribute.
Well, today's report is actually, in fact, dealing with a question written to former President Jacob Zuma about whether or not he would answer that question and whether he would appear. What kind of impact could that be around President Jacob Zuma?
Perhaps it's important, Marcel, to go back to the initial state of capture report when Madam Madonsela was investigating it. And you remind yourself that during that process, the president was quite obstructive. He didn't attend, he didn't respond, and at the time when he actually had the meeting with Mrs. Madonsela, he actually came with legal arguments. He didn't deal with the merits of the matter. And that was, of course, because Mrs. Madonsela, her tenure came to an end, and they thought by delaying the process with the new public protector coming into office, that would mean that they can perhaps sweep this under the carpet. And they were deliberately trying to delay the process. And that's when, once the report came out, of course, we then, we forgot about this, but of course, we just saw it in the insert that there were legal challenges to try and prevent this report from coming out.
And then when she could only release it just a few days before she was supposed to leave office?
Absolutely. And then once it was released, then it was fought in courts as well. So the president suffered many losses as a result of it. So do I expect the president to come and testify? I somehow don't think so. I don't think he will expose himself to that.
His lack of appearance, or if he maybe decides not to even send a written reply to the question from Judge Raymond Zondo, would that have a negative impact on the commission?
I don't think it will have a negative impact. The audi alteram partem, which means that we always give the other party an opportunity to respond, is one of the cornerstones of our justice system. We always give the person, the affected party, an opportunity to respond. It doesn't mean to say that if you don't respond, that you can now afterwards claim that the process was flawed or that it wasn't fair, because you never seized the opportunity to partake in it. So in this instance, if he doesn't respond, if he doesn't give a representation, if he doesn't attend, then I would imagine that the findings are going to be what we all expect. It might be the worst kept secret at the end of the day that the state was in fact captured.
So they'd have to work around that and try and glean evidence around all of that?
I would imagine, Marcel, that it would be one of those instances where the judge would say, listen, I have compelling evidence implicating you. You decided not to be part of this process. You decided not to make a representation, or you made a flimsy representation which doesn't deal with the merits. As a result, the only finding I can make is that the evidence which was presented to me is compelling and overwhelming, showing a state capture, and hence I'm now proposing the following remedial action. Because remember, of course, this inquiry would never have even been necessary if the then public protector had the opportunity of completing the process. And she couldn't because her tenure came to an end.
Now that report by Thuli Madonsela and her team obviously would form a very important part of the work that Judge Raymond Zondo and his team, Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo and his team would have set about in preparation for the commission. Would they then, as part of their preparation, have taken what was in that report and then explored further as they prepared for the commission?
Without a doubt. I think that is the core of the investigation. Remember the legal team that I spoke about earlier that he has appointed? I'm quite sure they would have run with the report and they would have investigated every aspect that was raised. But remember, of course, the basis of that report was, of course, the Minister Jonas, who came out with his evidence that he was being bribed to get the position of Minister of Finance. It was Faiki Mintur, who was offered the position of Public Enterprises Minister.
And then Themba Maseko saying he's the only one that said he actually had a conversation with then President
Absolutely.
Jacob Zuma.
And then, of course, we have the fact that the Minister of Finance, who was appointed one of the backbenchers in Parliament, who suddenly became overnight the new Minister of Finance, of course, there was evidence, overwhelming evidence, that he had attended Saxon World a number of opportunities, or on a number of times. And Ms. Madonsela specifically remarked about that and said, well, listen, there's something amiss for a minister that resides in Cape Town to attend Saxon World so often and then suddenly come out as the Minister of Finance.
And then when we haven't even mentioned Brian Molefe, who was in charge of Eskom at the time, and his phone records, location records, showing that he was in and around Saxon World repeatedly. And that's, of course, where we have one of our favorite stories around the Saxon World Shabin.
Absolutely.
We've almost forgotten about that story. Now, talking about those witnesses, the Mcebisi Jonas, specifically Themba Maseko, Faiki Mentor, those are going to be your three big witnesses that people are going to be looking forward to hearing from, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Marcel, if I think back to that, they should be saluted for being so brave at the time. I mean, they came out in the public domain and they, number one, said, listen, this happened to us and it cannot happen. That was despite the fact that the then President Zuma was in power. He had all his cronies occupying various key positions in government so that he could influence that. And then to come out and sacrifice their own political careers by saying, listen, this happened to us, it takes a lot of doing. So I've got no doubt that their testimony and their credibility will form a cornerstone. Because remember, they're not just the average Joe Soap.
Yeah,
we are talking about ministers. We're talking about ministers in government that come out and say, listen, you made this offer to me, and the president was in the same house at the time.
Now, the stories that they tell have become quite public. And then we've got stories like the Gupta jet that was allowed to land at Waterkloof. Those are all rather blatant examples of state capture. But what we're also going to see is a lot of nitpicking around the less blatant examples of state capture. The tenders through SOEs, the appointees that maybe were not as big name as the ones that we know of. There's going to be a lot of minutiae that's going to have to come out in this commission as well.
I think
Lots of paperwork.
The insert mentioned Tegeta. We know how important Tegeta was in the awarding of certain tenders for Eskom. And that doesn't even exclude Transnet. So there's no doubt that one of the cornerstones of this whole inquiry, other than the evidence of clear corruption, is going to involve how certain institutions were blatantly looted by the Gupta family by having money transferred to them. I mean, you remember there was advances of 660 million rand, which was in clear breach of the Finance Act. So there's going to be a volume of evidence that the poor Judge Zondo is going to deal with. But if there's anybody equipped to do so, I'm quite sure it's him.
It seems quite vast to a layperson such as myself. What kind of time frame are we talking about here?
Well, you remember when Mrs. Madonsela made a report known, she said the report must, or the inquiry or the commission must, within 180 days, report to Parliament. Now, the horse has bolted on 180 days. I mean, that's come and gone. And I believe from what I read that Judge Zondo and them have approached the court and asked for an extension. An extension was granted to 24 months. A rule nisi, which is an interim order, was granted to say, well, listen, I give an extension of 2 years for the inquiry to finish. So I somehow think we are starting on Monday. We can realistically maybe say 12 months, 24 months, the report would be out. It's not to say the evidence will only be adduced by then. The evidence might be within the public domain long before then, but the actual report with the findings, which I'm quite sure is going to consist of hundreds of pages, will only be out by then.
And of course, this happening as we move towards the 2019 political elections. So the legal world and the political worlds have been completely intertwined. What, just finally, Marius, what can we expect after this inquiry?
Well, I believe, I think shortly we will have a new appointment of the MPA boss. And we were all concerned about Mr. Abrams and the fact that he seemed to have a reluctance to prosecute certain individuals that were related or that were closely linked with the former President Zuma. So I believe we're going to have an impartial appointment of the MPA boss. And should we have that, we will have proper prosecutions taking place once the inquiry is completed. I can't see how there cannot be prosecutions in respect of Minister Jonas's incident where he was offered 600 million rand as a bribe. I can't see how there cannot be massive prosecutions in respect of tender fraud, overreaching, breaches of the Public Finance Act, and that doesn't even exclude things like the Estina dairy. It doesn't exclude Transnet, the locomotives. There must be prosecutions, and not only prosecutions, it must be successful prosecutions. So we need the MPA to fulfill its impartial role of being fearless in the face of adversity when it comes to prosecution. So we need that. And of course, we need this report to come out so that at the end of the day, we have belief in our government institutions again. When Eskom asks for money, we will believe that the money is actually being spent on infrastructure and not spent on lining people's pockets.
Oh, we're just going to have to wait and see. And I'm sure this won't be the last conversation. We have legal expert Marius du Toit. Thank you so much for your time.